Envy has always been one of the most uncomfortable feelings for humankind, but the Bible goes far beyond the modern concept. For us, envy is simply wanting what someone else has. But in the biblical world, it was seen as an internal poison that distorts the perception of reality, a silent weight that corrodes the soul without making a sound. Biblical envy is not just desiring, it is resenting the good fortune of another, as if it were a personal affront. Among the ancient sages of Israel, envy was considered one of the most dangerous sins because it is born hidden. It doesn't begin with open hatred, but with a discreet discomfort, a prolonged look, a silent comparison, a thought like, "Why not me?" Little by little, this feeling takes shape and gains ground within the heart, and when the person realizes it, they are already trapped in an emotional spiral that is difficult to break. In the modern world, envy has become even more common. Social media has turned comparison into a daily habit. The achievements of others appear on our cell phone screens before we even begin our day. And this constant exposure creates frustrations that our ancestors never faced with this intensity. The Bible, however, already warned, when the heart feeds on what another possesses, it loses the ability to see its own path. Envy is so destructive that it appears among the earliest conflicts in human history. From Cain and Abel, through Joseph's brothers to Saul persecuting David, this sin has always been linked to profound ruptures. It's no coincidence. Envy creates rivalries, distorts relationships, and pushes a person toward behaviors they never imagined committing. That is why the Bible treats this feeling with such seriousness. In this episode, we'll delve into the biblical meaning of envy, explore ancient cultures that shaped this understanding, analyze stories that reveal its destructive power, and understand how it continues to shape modern life. This is the second chapter in the series, and it's essential because envy always walks silently, and those who don't identify it fall. Today, you'll discover why this feeling is so dangerous and what the biblical path is to truly overcome it. In the Bible, the most commonly used word for envy in Hebrew is kina envy, which signifies an inner burning, almost like a fire that burns silently. It's a feeling that starts small but grows rapidly and uncontrollably. The Bible describes this fire as something that consumes from within, destroying the peace of the heart even before affecting any external relationships. Biblical envy is not passive, it's a corrosive process. In the Greek of the New Testament, the term phthonos also carries this idea of corrosion. It describes the person who not only desires what the other has, but is bothered by the fact that the other possesses something good. It's deeper than simple jealousy. It's displeasure at the success of others. This linguistic detail reveals that envy is not born from desire, but from resentment. It is sadness at the good fortune of another, and that is spiritually dangerous. The Bible clearly distinguishes between envy and jealousy. Jealousy can be protective, related to something that is already yours and that you fear losing. Envy, on the other hand, targets what has never been yours. Therefore, it destroys spiritual vision. It fixes your eyes on the path of others, preventing you from perceiving your own purpose. This confusion of focus creates a constant state of frustration and dissatisfaction. Ancient sages said that envy is a disease of the soul that dries up the bones. This phrase appears in Proverbs and describes how envy affects emotions, behavior, and even decisions. It transforms the other person into an invisible enemy and makes the person enter a race they will never win. Envy always generates comparison, and comparison always generates loss of identity. That is why it is spiritually deadly. Today, the definition of envy remains the same, only new scenarios have emerged. It appears when someone looks at another person's work, family, opportunities, or achievements and feels that it should have been theirs. The Bible does not treat envy as an emotional weakness, but as a spiritual deviation capable of destroying vision, purpose, and peace. Understanding its biblical definition is the first step to recognizing it where it hides, in the silence of the heart. The first time envy appears in the Bible is right at the beginning of human history, in the episode of Cain and Abel. And this is no accident. The biblical author places this scene early to show what this feeling is capable of producing when it is not confronted. Cain did not kill Abel because he initially hated him. but because he could not bear to see his brother's success. Envy distorted his vision until it transformed him into an enemy of his own blood. The offering accepted by God was not a privilege given to Abel, but an opportunity opened for Cain to adjust his heart. God speaks to Cain, warns him, guides him, and even offers a way out. But envy was already stirring within him. Instead of looking at his own situation, Cain fixed his eyes on his brother. And when the obsession with the success of another grows, discernment disappears. It is precisely at this point that envy becomes destructive. In the culture of that time, the offering was not a competition between brothers but a personal gesture of devotion. Cain transformed a spiritual moment into a dispute, and this reveals the inner workings of envy. It takes something that should be sacred and turns it into a comparison. This pattern continues today. Opportunities, talents, and achievements cease to be individual paths and become measures of personal worth, and the person gets lost, trying to surpass those they shouldn't surpass. When Cain takes Abel to the field, the Bible highlights an important detail. He acts as if nothing is wrong. This is the classic behavior of silent envy. It grows inside, while on the outside everything seems normal. Cain doesn't shout, doesn't argue, doesn't declare war. He keeps it silent until it explodes. The Bible uses this narrative to show that envy doesn't appear suddenly. It's built in the dark. In the modern world, history repeats itself on a different scale. Envy destroys not only blood relationships but friendships, partnerships, and even personal trajectories. It creates distorted perceptions. Someone begins to interpret the success of others as a threat to their own identity. Like Cain, many today are lost because they cannot look inward before looking to the side. And it is this inversion that transforms envy into one of the most dangerous sins. Envy doesn't appear only in Cain and Abel. It runs throughout the Bible as a common thread in the great human conflicts. The story of Joseph and his brothers is a classic example. They didn't hate Joseph for what he did, but for what he represented: favor, dreams, and a future. The colorful tunic was only the external symbol of a much deeper tension. Envy grew until it became cruelty, and it all began with a sideways glance. The Bible shows that envy always feeds on comparison. Joseph's brothers didn't just want their father's love, they wanted Joseph to have nothing special. This pattern reappears centuries later in the relationship between Saul and David. Saul loses his way when he hears that David was more celebrated than he was. Envy transforms a king into a persecutor and an ally into a threat. From then on, Saul ceases to govern guided by purpose and begins to govern guided by fear. The period of Jesus is also marked by this behavior. Many religious leaders were not bothered by the miracles themselves, but by Jesus' growing influence. They feared losing position, respect, and control. It wasn't just doctrinal disagreement. It was envy disguised as religious zeal. This behavior appears repeatedly in the Gospels, showing that envy is capable of distorting even spirituality. These stories reveal a clear pattern. Envy transforms ordinary people into imaginary rivals. Those who should be allies become threats. Those who should be inspirations become targets. Envy doesn't need a logical reason. It creates internal narratives to justify resentment. That's why it's so dangerous. It rewrites reality, pushes people towards impulsive decisions, and creates conflicts that could be avoided with a dose of lucidity. Today, this same pattern appears in families, businesses, churches, and friendships. Envy between siblings continues to destroy bonds. Envy among co-workers creates unhealthy competition. Envy among leaders erodes trust. Nothing has changed. Only the scenarios have changed. The Bible acts as a mirror because it reveals that envy always fragments, and all fragmentation begins with a gaze that loses the capacity to celebrate the other. Envy doesn't appear suddenly. It forms in small internal layers. The ancient Hebrews described this process as a yeast that grows in the heart. It all begins with an innocent comparison, but one that produces a slight discomfort. The person doesn't openly admit it, but feels unease when they see someone prospering. This discomfort doesn't seem serious at first, but that's exactly where the poison begins to spread. The Bible shows that envy arises when a person focuses on what others have instead of looking at their own path. When this focus is repeated, the mind creates a narrative. I have less. I deserved more. They are lucky. Life favors others. These phrases are not spoken aloud but silently shape perception. From there, the person begins to interpret the success of others as proof of their own failure. An interesting detail from ancient texts is that envy is always linked to resentment. It's not just desire, it's pain. A type of emotional pain that the person tries to hide but carries all the time. The rabbis describe this pain as an inner flame that doesn't consume the other person, but consumes the one who feels it. The more a person feeds thoughts of comparison, the stronger this flame becomes, and without realizing it, they begin to burn their own peace. Silent envy also grows through small distortions. The person begins to look at the other through a negative filter, minimizing their achievements and creating explanations that diminish their value. They succeeded because they had help. It must be luck. Nobody knows the truth. This type of thinking creates a false sense of protection. Instead of dealing with internal frustration, the person mentally attacks those who prosper. This is how the heart hardens. In the 21st century, this process has become even faster. Constant exposure to other people's lives through social media fuels relentless comparisons. Every achievement that appears in the feed becomes a trigger for this feeling. And without realizing it, many people start to feel worse every time they see someone doing well. Silent envy is as common today as it was in the past. It has only gained more visual stimuli, and when left unidentified, it transforms into a difficult emotional burden to bear. The Bible is straightforward. Envy always breeds division. It never builds, never unites, never strengthens. From the very first chapters, it appears as a force that breaks fundamental bonds. Envy caused Cain to break with Abel, made Joseph's brothers betray their own blood, and made Saul persecute David as an enemy. In all these cases, there was no logical reason. There were silent comparisons growing inside until they destroyed any sense of family. In the ancient world, relationships were based on honor, loyalty, and community. Therefore, envy was seen as an internal betrayal, even without words. When someone envied another person, it meant that an emotional distance had already been established. The other ceased to be a brother and became an adversary. This change is subtle but devastating. Envy dehumanizes the other, reducing their life to a target of personal frustration. The Bible also shows how envy leads to irrational behavior. Saul had everything: kingdom, power, recognition. Even so, he was consumed by the sight of David growing. This is the cruelest aspect of envy. It blinds. The person ceases to see their own worth and begins to live revolving around the life of another. Saul no longer ruled with purpose, but with obsession. Envy robs discernment even from those who have experience, strength, or position. In ordinary relationships, envy breeds suspicion, unnecessary competition, and emotional strain. The envious person begins to interpret everything as a threat. Praise for another becomes a personal offense. Career advancement is seen as an injustice. Talent becomes a nuisance. Over time, this creates a toxic emotional environment. The person celebrates nothing, trusts no one, and lives with the constant feeling of falling behind. Today, this dynamic appears in families, friendships, marriages, and even within churches. Envy creates rivalry where it shouldn't exist. It transforms allies into silent opponents and corrodes relationships that could be healthy. When the Bible says that envy is rottenness of the bones, it's talking about this: a slow but devastating process. It destroys emotional bonds not with explosions, but with accumulated resentments that are never confessed. Jesus doesn't use the word envy all the time, but he describes the behavior behind it with surgical precision. In the Gospels, envy appears as a kind of spiritual blindness that prevents a person from recognizing the truth even when it's right before their eyes. The religious leaders weren't just irritated by the miracles. They were bothered by Jesus' influence. Envy clouded their perception to the point that they rejected what they had hoped for centuries. One of the most powerful parables about this dynamic is that of the workers in the vineyard. Some received the same pay, even though they worked less. They didn't complain about the injustice, but because the other earned the same. Jesus exposes the core of envy there, the inability to celebrate the good in the path of another. This parable is not about economics. It speaks of the human heart, which feels wounded when another prospers. Jesus also confronts envy when he exposes the dispute among the disciples over greatness. They argued about who would be the greatest in the kingdom, revealing a hidden rivalry. Jesus places a child at the center and shows that greatness is not in comparison, but in simplicity. This gesture cuts the root of envy, the need to be superior. Jesus did not allow space for this internal game of competition. He called everyone back to the purpose. Envy appears even in the final moments of Jesus' life. Pilate realized that the religious leaders handed him over out of envy. This means that, emotionally, Jesus was not condemned solely on theological grounds, but also by comparison. His influence was growing, and this threatened the status of those who lived sustained by public recognition. Envy distorts vision to the point of transforming the innocent into a threat, and the wrong into justifiable. For Jesus, envy was not just a bad feeling, but a mental prison. It prevents a person from seeing their own mission and puts them in a never-ending race. Jesus teaches that the path to freedom lies in focusing on one's own calling, not in competing with the calling of another. Jesus' antidote was always clear: to serve, to celebrate, and to live with a pure heart. Where there is envy, there is no rest. Where there is purpose, comparison loses its power. The Bible not only exposes envy, it presents clear antidotes to neutralize this feeling before it destroys a person's life. The first of these is gratitude. In the ancient world, giving thanks was not a formality. It was a spiritual discipline. Gratitude aligned the mind with reality and reminded the heart that God was the source of everything. Those who practice gratitude daily have less internal space for comparison, because they learn to see the value of what they already possess. Another powerful antidote is contentment. The word used by Paul conveys the idea of inner sufficiency. It is not conformity, but maturity. For the Jews, contentment was a sign of emotional wisdom, a heart that finds rest in its own path. A person who lives in this attitude may even desire to grow, but without resenting the success of others. Contentment liberates from silent competition and restores mental peace. The Bible also presents humility as a cure for envy. Humility here is not timidity, but spiritual clarity. It is knowing that each person has their own measure, their own time, and their own purpose. Jesus taught that no one loses when another advances because the kingdom of God is not a system of scarcity. Humility allows one to celebrate the good of others without feeling threatened, and this profoundly corrects the roots of envy. Another important antidote is the service. Ancient rabbis claim that serving others heals inner rivalries because it shifts the focus from ego to the well-being of others. Jesus demonstrates this by washing the disciples' feet, a gesture that destroys any silent comparison. The person who serves develops empathy and breaks the cycle of envy because they learn to value the other person's journey without feeling diminished. Finally, the Bible teaches the practice of constant reflection. The psalmists asked God to search their hearts precisely because they knew that envy thrives in the shadows. Biblical self-knowledge is not empty introspection, it is spiritual alignment. When a person recognizes their internal triggers and surrenders that feeling to God, they regain clarity. That is true healing, not ignoring envy, but confronting it before it contaminates decisions, emotions, and relationships. Envy in the 21st century hasn't disappeared. It's just changed scenery. Today it doesn't happen in open fields like in Cain's time, but on the illuminated screens of cell phones. Social media has become a showcase displaying achievements, travels, bodies, careers, and relationships at a constant speed. The problem isn't the exposure, but the psychological effect. The mind begins to compare itself unconsciously, and the heart absorbs this as daily frustration. Technology has amplified what the Bible already warned against. Envy is looking at someone else's life and feeling that your own is insufficient. In the past, comparisons were limited to the social circle. Today, you compare yourself to thousands of people at the same time. Some aren't even real, they're edited versions. The feeling of falling behind is much greater because the bar is constantly being raised. This creates an emotional pressure that ancient people never faced in this way. This new scenario produces a quieter and more sophisticated type of envy. It's not the old, declared, and aggressive envy. It's one that hides behind smiles, likes, and polite comments. The person doesn't wish ill on the other, but feels bad when the other is doing well. It's exactly the same biblical mechanism, only packaged in modern aesthetics. The Bible describes this as drying up the bones, and today we see it in anxiety, low self-esteem, and discouragement. Another point is the wounded self-image. Constant comparison robs one of identity and creates an unattainable ideal. This affects relationships, productivity, and spirituality. The person stops seeing their own talents and lives trying to conform to what they see in others. This behavior is a modern update of Saul's envy of David. Life becomes a silent competition with someone who isn't even competing. The mind becomes exhausted from trying to prove its worth. But the Bible remains relevant when it says that envy is unnecessary and destructive. Each person has their own time, their own purpose, their own battles, and their own processes. When the heart stops looking at the path of others and returns to looking at its own, peace returns. The 21st century didn't invent envy. It only accelerated it. And precisely for this reason, biblical principles become even more essential. They restore direction, rest, and focus in a world that lives in constant comparison. Envy is one of humanity's oldest sins, yet it continues to shape behavior today with the same force as millennia ago. The Bible presents it not as a fleeting feeling, but as a silent distortion that sickens the soul. It begins when the heart loses focus on its own path and starts to see the success of others as a threat. From that point, inner peace begins to fragment, and decisions become distorted. By examining the stories of Cain, Joseph's brothers, Saul, and the religious leaders of Jesus' time, we perceive a clear pattern. Envy always transforms ordinary people into rivals. It exchanges admiration for resentment, purpose for competition, and clarity for confusion. None of this happens all at once. It's a slow erosion. And precisely because it is silent, it becomes so dangerous. The downfall begins in the heart before it manifests in actions. But the Bible also reveals that envy doesn't have to rule anyone. Gratitude, contentment, humility, service, and deep reflection are real paths to healing. They restore the clarity to the heart that comparison has taken away. They put a person back on their own path of purpose and break the cycle of resentment. The Bible doesn't condemn to destroy, it exposes to restore. And when someone recognizes where envy has entered, they have already begun the healing process. This is the second chapter in our series, and it's crucial because envy is a feeling that adapts to the 21st century invisibly. Today, comparison is a daily habit, and envy can take hold before a person even realizes it. Therefore, following this series is more than just learning biblical trivia. It's about understanding how ancient spiritual patterns still govern modern behaviors. Each episode offers clarity and prevention. If this content resonated with you, I ask that you follow the channel. Not to inflate numbers, but because the purpose here is unique, to explain the Bible with historical depth and apply it to real life in a practical and transformative way. Many people are trapped in behaviors they don't even understand, and this series can open the eyes of those who need it. Subscribing to the channel guarantees you won't miss the next chapters of this journey, and they will surprise you.